Carlos Alcaraz improved his serve again. If you remember a video that I made right at the start of the French Open, I showed a new and improved serve technique from Carlos Alcaraz. And in this video, while I applauded Carlos Alcaraz for making great changes on his serve, it wasn't quite perfect. There was one technical detail that was still suboptimal, and that was the late coil. The great news for Carlos is that based on the footage that I've seen from January 3rd, credit goes to this Instagram account from Juan. Carlos Alcaraz has gotten rid of the late coil. Now, for this to make sense to you, I'm going to have to explain Carlos Alcaraz's serve technique history. So when Carlos Alcaraz was in juniors, he served with a full lag, meaning that he would toss the ball first and the racket would lag behind. And then when he came on the ATP Tour very early on, he had a very different service motion. He would go up together with his racket arm and his toss arm, and the racket would be pointing forward and was very far away from his body. Now, as you probably know, Carlos has a pinpoint stance serve, and while the racket was in this position, he would pull the back foot up to the front foot, and it is then where he would start coiling his elbow and start loading his body. I categorize this movement as a late coil because it's happening in isolation. So there's going to be different styles regarding the coil. Some players will initiate the coil very early in their service motion. Other players will toss the ball first and then take their racket up and begin to coil. And the advantage of doing the coiling movement in these ways is that the coil is not happening in isolation. It is part of the entire service rhythm. So when Carlos showed up at the French in 2024, he got rid of this awkward serve technique, but he didn't get rid of the late coil. So Carlos introduced a lag into his serve, just like he did in juniors, where he would toss the ball first, the racket would lag behind. He would start pulling up the back foot to the front foot as the racket was going towards the trophy phase. So the timing of the pinpoint stance improved tremendously, and he also severely reduced that isolated movement of the racket when the back foot was already towards the front foot. So the serve looked a lot cleaner during that French Open, and he maintained this technique for the rest of the year. However, as I said in that video, a close examination of Carlos's serve will reveal that, possibly based on muscle memory, he still had a late coil. So the serve technique that Carlos utilized in 2022 and 2023, where the racket would be towards the side, he would then pull the back foot up to the front foot and then coil his elbow and get into the loading position. Well, he built up a lot of muscle memory from this movement. So even when he changed his serve technique and started lagging the racket behind and got his racket to be a lot closer to his body, once he got into that trophy position, there was still a slight elbow movement because Carlos naturally serves with a coil. So when the racket is about to drop, his elbow is behind the body. So even on that improved serve, starting at the French Open, Carlos still had a slight late coiling movement. Now, the good news is that based on this footage from January 3rd, Carlos got rid of the late coil. So here are the changes on Carlos's serve. He has lengthened the lag. So there's a different racket position when he lags the racket behind. At the start of the French Open, the racket was somewhere around here. Now the racket is pointing more towards the ground. And while this might seem trivial, this is important in how the racket goes up towards the trophy phase. So generally, when players stop their lag, for example, Novak Djokovic, the racket will go up on the player's side as it approaches the trophy phase. When the racket in the lag is more pointing backwards and down, now as the racket goes up, it will be pointing towards the back fence as it's going into the trophy phase. Players like Sampras, Ivanisevic had this type of style. Now in the context of Carlos's serve, this makes a lot of sense because remember, he used to go here with his racket and then pull the back foot up. The French Open serve, he did lag his racket behind, but it was still pointing towards the side, and as he took it up, the racket was still slightly pointing forward. Carlos's new serve doesn't do that anymore because he's going down and a little bit further back in the lag phase, and when he takes that racket up, the elbow starts to coil much sooner. So there's absolutely no more late coiling on Carlos's serve, and he accomplished that by changing the way the racket goes up into the trophy phase. When you look at Carlos's repertoire of strokes, he's got the complete package. That's why people in the past have compared him to a mixture of Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer. But out of all the strokes, in my opinion, the serve had the most room for improvements, and it is nice to see that someone even as good as Carlos, who has 4 Grand Slams, is still working on his game and trying to maximize his potential. And it also shows you the complexity of the tennis serve. While Carlos' serve has always been good, he's never really showed up on the top of the statistics regarding the best servers in the world. So it's going to be interesting to see whether in 2025 Carlos Alcaraz can improve his serve stats with his new and improved serve technique.